Okay, in this video, I want to help you understand these readings this week about how we think in metaphors, how that influences our politics. And then I want you to connect that back to the readings you had about the legal narratives that people have. And I really want you to start understanding kind of this idea that you came into class with and what you showed me when you interviewed your family and friends, that people very wrongly believe in this myth of law as an ideal, that it will have the ability to control people, it'll get them to behave better, and that it will bring about equality. We want to see why that's not correct in reality. So, the first thing that you have to understand is that we want to really understand our own metaphors. Now, this is difficult because we don't often think about metaphors. We don't learn about metaphors often in school. And then also, this is largely unconscious. So we stop thinking about these things. It's kind of like breathing. Unless you really pay attention to your breathing or you're doing yoga or something, right? You just kind of take it for granted. And so these are worldviews that we have that we don't really think about because that would be, time consuming each day. But it's also because you didn't come up with these on your own, right? They were given to you by your family. They were imposed upon you by your social group. You were reinforced, or you had to learn a new system when you went to school, or if you're, have run-ins with police, right? So everybody kind of has their own worldview, and then you're kind of shifting and shaping that as you go along. The key here is to remember from that reading that your politics is defined by this story that you're telling yourself. And this is the one that helps you understand. Usually it starts with your family. And so your family usually has, at least in the United States, has one of these two ideas. Now, this is not typical of other countries, other cultures, although it could be similar depending on where you're from. But because the United States is so focused on individualism as another myth, then these two kind of fall into these categories. One being the strict father model, do as I say kind of thing. So this really goes along with those of you who are defining law as a punishment system, right? You must follow it or else there will be consequences. That would fit very strongly within the strict father metaphor model. For those of you who are focusing on rights and that it's focused on equality, that's more of the nurturing parent model, right? And so you don't see law as a punishment, you see it as like an incentive to get people to get along with each other. Now, just so that everybody's clear, neither one of you are wrong. This isn't about right or wrong. This is just helping us better understand why people have different ideas about what law and politics are. The different ideas come from the meaning that you generate from your interactions with your family members, with your social groups, right? The places you go and hang out. And because you're not exposed to everybody all the time, people are going to have different interpretations of what these words mean. Now, in both situations, whether it's the nurturing parent or the strict father model, people are using moral accounting. So this helps you explain your expectations and predictions of behavior. And Lakoff in the reading gives you a bunch of examples of that. But the most typical kind of situation is you get what you deserve, right? That's how people kind of think about, or they think about it in the sense of, I gave you something and so I'm entitled to something back, right? Treat others as you would treat yourself, right? These are very economic ways of thinking about that. So this really explains our morals, how we think about morals in this society in America based on individualism and commerce, right? Everything's kind of put through this banking model metaphor. And so you want to think about now, really what is your political model? What is the metaphor that you're used to hearing? Is it the strict father model? Or is it the nurturing parent model? Because this will help you better understand your politics and how you're interpreting the construct of law. Now, to switch gears a little bit, it's really you have to understand that law is an abstract map. It's not a real thing, and so it's something like, this is a good kind of cartoon here, is that it's not reality, right? So in the cartoon here, the reality is that this is an elephant, right? This is biologically an elephant. If we were to get our science instruments out, we could measure all sorts of ways that this is an elephant, and it's not what all these people think it is. But because people are at a different part of the elephant, right? They're in a different relationship with the map, right? Their map is really just focused on the thing that they're experiencing. And so the person who's just staring at this big gray thing in front of them, that's a wall, right? The person who's focused on the tail section, right, it looks like a rope. In other words, this is the perception that people have, and that's the map that they form is based on their perception. And so the elephant here is law, right? It means whatever the person thinks it means within their own social group. Now, this cartoon would be better if your family members were kind of surrounded by each of these people, right? Because the individual doesn't come up with these ideas. These ideas are taught to them by their family members and then school and these social places. But what comes out is that in the white Anglo-Saxon tradition, for example, the ideal for liberty, the ideal for law, so law is the ideal for liberty, right? It's none of the things that you typically put in your answers in this class. The historical white male perspective has been law is there to protect against government, against other people, that you have the right to be left alone. And so the government can't interfere with you. And that was their historical meaning, that was their map. Whereas today you hear a lot of people in this diverse society that we live in, they crave for law to be an ideal for punishment, that people should get what they deserve. They're very upset when this doesn't happen this way. That's very different from the historical perspective of what law is. Very different map, right? Their perception is based on different experiences. There's also this kind of ideal for social control. You'll hear this when people say, like, healthcare is a human right, housing is a human right, I have rights, right? That's important. It's a political process. These are things that people want, but they have their own perception on what law should be. Their map is based on this idea of rights. And then the people who are forming kind of this expectation of rights, right? They go through their life with experiences of getting rights. They believe that they're born with protection. So you have people, for example, with the COVID vaccine, they should be protected against getting the vaccine. And so you kind of see how some of these games can blend and mix together, and people start to use different metaphors, different abstractions, different maps to kind of fit their perception of their time. But the key here is that it's not everyone shares the same perception. They don't all share the same map. In fact, every group has kind of a different map based on their own perception. The second thing is to understand that no one sees the elephant, right? So no one has a good definition of what law is. They all have their own unique expectation and predictions of it. So then I gave you this case study that looks at what should be a pretty clear idea, right? People say, well, healthcare is a human right. Now, you should think, I'm going to go back to the slide for a second, right? Which narrative is that? That's the one where people are saying this is the ideal for rights. I'm born with protection. Okay, so if there's a concept called healthcare as a human right, then we all think and we all expect we should get healthcare and that there should be no denial of healthcare. Well, that's the myth. That's the ideal. That's not reality. In reality, millions of people are being denied healthcare. They're being discriminated against. They're being treated unfairly. So that's the reality. So the myth and the reality here don't really match, right? Now, one could argue, I think very sensibly, that the myth comes from the reality, right? We don't like this idea that people are being bused to San Francisco from Nevada just to avoid, the hospital being liable and having to provide healthcare. In the cases that you study, people are being sent from Missouri to another state, from Florida to another state, right? Hospitals are going to extreme measures to make sure that people don't get care. And why are they doing this? They're saying, well, these people don't have the ability to pay. So what they're saying is that poor people don't deserve healthcare. So then it's not really a human right. It's a privilege, right? It's something that if you can pay for it, you get it. But if you can't, you don't. And then other people who don't qualify for Medicare, or they don't qualify for government assistance, or the particular procedure they need isn't covered, or they have a pre-existing condition. I mean, the list goes on and on and on for the excuses of why you can't provide this human right to people. That's the reality. So in the 1980s, the problem got bad enough, people were mad enough, and the Congress listened, and so a bill became a law, right? And I kind of assume that you've, through high school or you've through YouTube channels, understand how bills become laws, how legislation occurs. And so this particular law is called EMTALA, and it requires, no matter what, that if you get government money, which 99.9% of hospitals do, then you can't turn anyone away. You have to treat them. And so this seems like it's clear cut, right? People say, yay. In fact, people celebrate this. They said, oh, look, we finally have a law that healthcare is a human right. Okay, so what happened? Well, the new law has words in it, and people kind of can read what they want into the words. And so Congress was very careful, and this was bipartisan, meaning both Republicans and Democrats agreed that people shouldn't be dumped onto the streets because they can't pay for health care. It's a big problem, right? It creates other problems that they don't want to have to pay for later. Policing problems, mental health problems, right? Larger public health problems. Somebody with a severe disease, you don't want to just throw them out on the street and hope everything goes okay. So there's two pieces to this, and this is where it gets tricky. The one is that you have to stabilize the person. So the person, once they're stabilized, then they can be sent to a different hospital or a different healthcare facility. Or if they are well enough, right? Most of us who've been in the hospital, we get well, and then they send us out. We're discharged. But they have to be stable. If they are stabilized, right? If that can be determined, then the hospital, right, is no longer liable. Right? They've provided the service, they can get reimbursed by the government, but right, they don't necessarily have to look for every single problem. So in other words, somebody comes in with an emergency condition and then they find out they've got diabetes, right? It's not up to the ER to provide the medications necessary. They'll need to go somewhere else. And so there's some flexibility here. But some of you could be looking at this and still say, well, but this is still pretty clear, right? If I go to the dictionary and I see appropriate medical screening requirement and stabilization requirements, I can look up those words and I can form a general understanding of what should occur here. The problem is that, well, it's going to be case by case and it's going to be determined using medical practice. How does this, and not doctors here, we're talking about hospital administrators, insurance companies. How do they define these terms? How are these terms used in habits and customs? And so what seems like it's a response, what seems like, the law is going to provide consequences for these people if they violate it, well, that's not what happens. We get three different interpretations. So first thing you kind of have to understand to make sense of this is that even though you might have learned in another class, there's one federal law. Well, that's not exactly true. There's different circuits of federal courts. And so depending on what circuit you're in, we happen to be in the Second Circuit over here, this little pale blue color. But the cases that we're referring to in the reading, for example, are in the 11th Circuit or the 9th Circuit, right? And you look at these kind of different circuits, well, they have different judges. They're different human beings that are in this place. But more importantly, putting the pieces together from this week, they have different politics. And so they are going to have different metaphors and different legality narratives of how to interpret the law and the cases that they see. So very broadly stroked, putting back to the Lakoff reading about metaphors, Republicans are for tort reform. They want to change, they want to make it harder for people to sue hospitals and doctors, and to be blunt, they spread disinformation about something called litigation lotteries. And there's been lots of studies that have showed that there's no such thing. But you might believe that there's a litigation lottery because it's been the fake news, the false information has been so influential. It gets people to believe things that aren't real because it matches their metaphor, it matches their narrative. On the other hand, on the other party, Democrats want to use tort law as opposed to legislation. They think that using the courts is a good way to punish bad doctors and to provide care for patients who suffer unfair treatment in healthcare. Now, these are the political arguments. If you talk to doctors and hospitals, they don't like either of these, right? These aren't very good healthcare arguments. These are law and politics arguments. But notice what's going on here is we've got the strict father, right? That you have to follow the rules, and if you follow the rules, you'll get healthcare. Versus the nurturing parent metaphor that says, well, not everybody is able to follow the rules, and the rules are super ambiguous, and people don't all get treated fairly, and so you have to provide nurturing healthcare for those people. So the point that you have to get here is that there isn't one law, there isn't one way of applying this, and that's why you get different interpretations of the law. So generally speaking, if you're in the 2nd or the 9th Circuit, if you're on the West Coast or if you're in New York, you will likely get healthcare. you will likely not be patient dumped. But if you're in Florida or Georgia or Missouri, you are very likely going to be patient dumped, right? It doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but you're in a place where the judges have ruled that they're very lenient for the hospitals, that what they define as stable, you might not think you're stable, but the courts have said, oh, they're stable enough. Whereas that's not true in the other districts. Some want very much to make sure that you're 100% stable. And so the law will be applied differently in different parts of the country based on the metaphor and based on the legality narrative. So if I apply, some of you wanted more examples about the legal narrative. The best examples are the ones that you gave me, right? So in your week 5 assignment, here are some of the things that you and your fellow students said, that this is what law is. And what I want you to see here is that most people believe in this myth of law, and these myths contradict each other. And so some people think that that law is a system of rules created to keep the society safe. Well, if you apply that to the law that was passed to keep people from dumping patients, it doesn't do that. It doesn't create a society that keeps people safe. So people believe it is, but it isn't really in actual life. Other people say it's a rule you must follow. There will be consequences. Again, in that situation, there weren't any consequences for the hospitals who violated the law in those districts, where if they were somewhere else, there would have been consequences. So the consequences aren't automatic. They'll depend on where you are and what people believe the rule means, right? So people have different ideas of what they think that rule is. People say they're meant to protect us, and that's what laws are, and that's what rights are. Again, that's not true in real life. That might be what people want it to be, but that's not what it's really actually doing. And then another student said what they got from friends and family was that it's the ability to let you do or not do something, and that sometimes it can do good, and sometimes it protects bad people, and sometimes it affects our daily life, and sometimes it tells us what to do and not to do. This is a perfect example of the contradictions. It can't do all of these things. It doesn't do one of these things, right? So it depends, again, on the group and who is really experiencing this and what their perception is. So I kind of put the cartoon here of it's not a clear thing. It's confusing. It's not something that everybody can wrap their hands around and say, this is what it absolutely is. It's not like the quote unquote, the law of gravity or the law of thermodynamics. Those are scientific laws that have been proven to be true. Legal rules are not those kind of scientific laws. So the thing you really have to understand is law is not a thing, right? So there's this great kind of historical painting here of that this is not a pipe. This is a map of a pipe. This is a representation of a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe, but this is not the actual pipe, right? So you can't take this, put some tobacco in it and smoke it. It's just a picture. So this is the perception that people have when they think about law, is that it's the thing they think it is in their brain, in their mind. They say, well, this is what it must be for everyone. It's not. It's just a representation. It's just a map. And so laws, right? So that's the key thing here is law is not a singular one thing like a pipe. It's many ideas. And those can be natural. Those can be things that people think we have by birth, that we're right, that we should be protected. Or they could be positive, meaning that they can be legislation, rules on the subway, codes, right? It's kind of the Hammurabi Code, right? The Napoleonic Code. They could be habits, just way people kind of live their lives, and you get used to that. I mean, the jaywalking law in New York, for example, is clear that you can jaywalk because that's what people do. It's a habit. Whereas you go to other parts of the country, you'll get a ticket for that. So they can be norms, they can be expectations and predictions that people have. They can be things that kind of come into your mind and you say, well, I think everybody should behave this way. But they're also routines. They're things that you get into the habit of doing because that the structure around you, the system around you is kind of forcing you to do that, like showing your ID if you go to Kingsborough. They're also rituals, things that happen at places like places of worship, or if you go to the gym, right? There's rituals that people go through, and those are laws. But, concretely, they're also words, they're phrases. And these words and phrases form expectations, and they get people to behave differently based on what they think those words and phrases mean within their own family and their own social group. But they're also cases, right? They're things we can read about. They're judicial decisions. They're the decisions that judges make about the cases. And those are all different and happen one at a time kind of thing. There are also principles that judges and scholars like me and other people, we write about, and we put those into books and we categorize them. And all of these things are constructs that connect many meanings. It's not one thing. That's the main thing I'm trying to get people to understand. So, you can put law into Google search and it will give you a very stupid definition that now you should see and be able to explain to your friends and family that it's none of those things, because it's not a thing. It's not a pipe. Now, these perceptions are particular to your family and social group, right? That's where you make meaning out of these words and phrases and your expectations of behavior. And these conflict with other social groups and social institutions. For example, in schools, on the subway, at the doctor, in the workplace, in government, in buildings, on the streets, right? All the places where different social groups come together. So there's not a universal standard of behavior that everyone follows. That would be impossible. However, the majority views of these norms, which are expectations and predictions of how people will behave, are historical and they're based on power. That's why the power majority maintains its power, because they maintain the definition of these rules, because they're in places of power. They're in the courts, right? They are judges, they are politicians, they are business leaders. They're the ones who are forming the meaning as it is applied by other people in the system. So it's not very democratic if you think about it that way. It's not what a majority of the country believes these rules should be. It's what the majority of the people who are in power positions actually use these rules for. And so I'd have you go back to the video that talks about the legality narratives, why people who are experiencing the law differently view the law differently. If it's working for them and they're in a position of power, they're much more likely to see it as a game, as a way for them to get ahead. If it's constantly being used against them and they're in a position of powerlessness, or they're being discriminated against, they're much more likely to see it as something that's up against them, that they're never going to be able to escape. And so you need to understand it in that sense. One final thing I'd like you to think about is that typically, in the 12 years that I've been collecting information from students about this at Kingsborough, is that it's a very common thing. Students want the law to be about fairness. However, if you study the historical idea of law, which is largely what a constitutional law class is about, is that it's looking at what were the original ideas about law. And again, that was not common among white men in the United States, was not about fairness. In fact, I tried to get you to understand through some of the readings that it was the opposite of that, that they were really using law to create unfairness and to maintain unfairness to benefit those white men. And so it's curious, right? Isn't it interesting? What's a good explanation for the difference between the majority preference of the right to be left alone, so not fairness, that I get to be left alone to keep me unfair and separate from you, and then the limits of law that kind of are used to make sure that law cannot be used to change my advantage, that it can't be used against me. And then the expectations of students at Kingsborough, and obviously other places, it's not just Kingsborough, but in my experience at Kingsborough, students want law to be fair and used as a tool for social control. What explains that? And what I mean here again is to think about it this way. One way of looking at it is that the majority of students at Kingsborough are women of color. That's the largest group. The second largest group are immigrants, and first in the family to attend college. So what metaphors, what legality narratives are we using here in South Brooklyn, in New York City, that might be different than people who are in different parts of the country who have a different experience with the law? So you really want to be thinking again about the strict father metaphor and the nurturing parent metaphor. The idea that law would be about rights and that it would be used for fairness and to be used as social control, that's a nurturing parent metaphor. The right that it would be to be left alone, that I am separate from you and that's what law is for me, that's the strict father metaphor. And then also that would be with the law, right? The strict father metaphor really works with the idea that it's a game, that I get to, those who know the rules best are most likely to be able to use law effectively. Whereas the nurturing parent metaphor is going to be more often with the before the law and to resist the law. That these are going to be like, basically it's before the law if it's a good nurturing parent, and it's resisting the law if it's a bad nurturing parent or a bad strict father that's abusing or discriminating against the child. And so you kind of want to think about why social groups have such a big influence over not just how the law is practiced, but in the expectations. Why is it that the groups that are experiencing the most discrimination want the law and view the law and believe that the law is all about fairness, when in fact that's not what you're experiencing and that's not what the reality is in practice?